Whatever, man.
Hey, we need
Was
that
it given in a book form? No, Allah gave by word form. Wahi. Zabur is the revelation, the wahi that Allah Bari Ta'ala gave to Hazrat Dawud alayhi salam. We believe that what was given was from Allah. The Injil,
Zabur is a very funny topic.
the Injil,
Seeing the book, the Torah that he had.
who's assured
Zabur, this is the...
is the Torah. Whatever.
Whatever, man.
Hey, we need
Was
that
it given in a book form? No, Allah gave by word form. Wahi. Zabur, whatever.
Okay, so there's a very simple response, or there's a very simple solution to this point. Now, if you read the Quran chapter 5 verse 44 and the Quran chapter 3 verse 3, it says Allah revealed the Torah to Moses, the key word being revealed. Now, does that mean that the Old Testament, Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Exodus, was revealed to Moses? No, it's talking about the Torah that was revealed from God to Moses. That doesn't necessarily mean it was given in a written form. It could have been, like Ahmed Deedat said, a oral form or some kind of revelation. Like the Quran was revealed as a oral message. Same thing with the Torah. The Torah was probably revealed by Allah to Moses as a oral message, not necessarily as a written message. Even if the Torah was written by Moses as, directed or dictated by Allah, that Torah written by Moses no longer survives today, because we know the Old Testament Torah, which contains Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Exodus, was written after Moses. It wasn't written by Moses, it was written after Moses. So the Old Testament books were written after Moses and not by Moses. Thus the Quran cannot be and can never confirm the Old Testament, which was written after Moses. It's only confirming the revelation by Allah to Jesus, or by Allah to Moses, which could be in written form, or could be in oral form, or could be both. So Moses wrote the Torah, but the Quran is possibly alluding to some written document by Moses that no longer exists today. So the Quran is not confirming or affirming the Old Testament, Genesis to Exodus. It's confirming the Torah by Moses as directed by Allah, which no longer exists today. It doesn't exist because we know Moses, there's no book written by Moses known to exist today. There's no oral Torah that exists today. Well, there is, but it's considered like after Moses' time. So, the Quran is confirming, the reveal. The Quran is not saying the Old Testament, like Genesis, Leviticus, etc., was revealed by Allah to Moses. It's talking about the Torah that was revealed by Allah to Moses, which could be in written form, could be in oral form, but that Torah of Moses is not the Old Testament that the Jews wrote, or the Israelites wrote, after Moses died. So I think David Wood and Apus and Sam, wife Peter Shamoon, always get confused on that. Like, they don't understand. Like, just use little common sense here. And this is the problem with David Wood and Apus and Shamoon. They don't know, and James White, they don't have common sense. The Quran never talks about the Old Testament. The Quran never mentions the Old Testament. The Quran never mentions the New Testament. The Quran never mentions that, the New Testament was revealed to Jesus, or the Old Testament was revealed to Moses, or the book of Genesis or Leviticus or whatever was revealed to Moses. It's talking about the Torah, that Allah revealed the Torah to Moses. That does not mean that the Old Testament was revealed to Moses, like Genesis to Exodus, etc., etc. So this is what David Wood and Apus fail to understand, is when the Quran's talking about the Torah, it's talking about a revealed book and not a written book. And even if it was talking about a written book, it's talking about the Torah written by Moses, which no longer exists today, because the Old Testament, Genesis, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, was written, or the Old Testament Torah was written after Moses. Thus the Quran cannot be confirming the Old Testament. Because the Old Testament is never mentioned in the Quran. That word Old Testament or Bible is never mentioned in the Quran. It's just talking about the Torah. What is the Torah? It is a revealed or a written form that Moses wrote as dictated to him by Allah, which is not the Old Testament. So it's very simple that David Wood just doesn't understand, is that the Quran is not confirming the Old Testament that we know today, like Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, etc. It's talking about the Torah that was revealed to Moses, which no longer exists today. Same thing with the gospel. Allah revealed the gospel to Jesus, and that gospel is not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or Acts of the Apostles, or Revelations, etc. So the Quran is not confirming the Old Testament and New Testament. The Quran is confirming, a revelation given to Moses and Jesus, and that revelation does not equal the Old Testament and New Testament, because those books were written after Moses and Jesus. And the Quran is talking about revealed documents, or a revealed document, or a revealed oral message to Moses and Jesus, which we no longer have access to today. So the Quran is not confirming the Old Testament and New Testament. It's talking about a revelation from Allah to Jesus, or from Allah to Moses and Jesus, which no longer exists today. As we know, both these figures never wrote down anything, or even if they wrote down anything, it no longer exists today. And even if there was some kind of message, some kind of oral Torah or oral gospel of Jesus, it doesn't exist today. And that's what the Quran is talking about. The revelation as revealed by Allah to Moses and Jesus, as the Quran chapter 3 verse 3, and the Quran chapter 5 verse 44, and Quran chapter 5 verse 46 talk about. And those revelations no longer exist today. Thus the Quran is talking about, revelations given to Moses and Jesus, which we just don't have access to, as we know the Old Testament and New Testament was written after Moses and Jesus. Thus the Quran cannot, thus it's impossible to conclude that the Quran is talking about the Old Testament and New Testament when these books were written after Moses and Jesus, and not during the same time as Moses and Jesus, as Allah revealed the Torah and Gospel to Moses and Jesus. But we know the Old Testament and New Testament came much after Moses and Jesus, respectively. So hopefully this clears up the whole, what is the Quran talking about by the Torah and the Gospel? It's not talking about the Old Testament and New Testament. It just talking about the revelation given from Allah to Moses and Jesus, which don't exist today. So hopefully this clears up this point. But David Wood will never get it. He'll keep repeating the same thing over and over and over again. But I don't want him misleading innocent people or innocent Muslims. Stay tuned. More videos coming up ahead.